Everything about the tournament seemed to be lining up perfectly for Alex. The preparation, the schedule, the momentum from previous tournaments, even the timing before the French Open all pointed in the same direction. Her team believed the plan was working exactly the way they wanted. She had already become one of the biggest breakthrough stories in women's tennis during the 2026 season, climbing the rankings faster than almost anyone expected and turning every tournament appearance into a major event for Filipino fans around the world. But then Strasbourg happened. And suddenly the match stopped feeling like a normal early round contest and started feeling like something much larger, something the tennis world is still trying to fully understand. Because once the emotional truth behind the matchup became public, the entire story changed. This was not simply a young rising star facing a lower-ranked qualifier. This was two completely different human realities colliding on one court. One side carried momentum, rising expectations, international attention, and the pressure of a rapidly growing career. The other carried war, separation, family sacrifice, and emotions that reached far beyond tennis itself. That other story belonged to Alexandra Olikova. What many fans did not realize before the match was how emotionally significant this tournament had become for her personally. Her father had been serving in the Ukrainian military during the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and because of that, she had not seen him attend one of her matches live since the summer of 2024. Think about what that means for a professional athlete. Nearly 2 years of competing without one of the most important people in your life sitting courtside. Nearly 2 years of victories, losses, injuries, breakthroughs, and emotional moments experienced through distance instead of presence. Then suddenly, after all that time, he was coming to France. Her father had received a short 2-week military break before returning to the front lines, and Strasbourg became one of the rare opportunities for him to finally watch his daughter compete in person again. For Olikova, that changed everything emotionally. She later admitted that she kept thinking about it constantly before the match. Knowing her father would be in the stands after such a long separation made every moment feel heavier. Every point carried emotional significance. Every game felt connected to something larger than rankings or tournament progress. And honestly, once you understand that context, the atmosphere surrounding the match begins to make much more sense. Because sports sometimes create moments where the emotional reality underneath the competition becomes impossible to ignore. Strasbourg became one of those moments. Beneath the rallies and scorelines was a much deeper story involving identity, war, family reunion, sacrifice, and resilience. Meanwhile, Ila entered the match carrying her own enormous pressure. At only 20 years old, she had already become one of the most talked about young players in women's tennis. Her rise through the rankings had transformed her into a national symbol in the Philippines, and every tournament now came with expectations that barely existed a year earlier. Fans expected big runs. Media coverage intensified. Opponents viewed her differently. Every performance became part of a larger conversation about how far she could go in the sport. That combination made the emotional contrast between the two players extraordinary. One athlete was fighting to continue a breakthrough season under growing international attention. The other was fighting through the emotional reality of finally playing in front of her father again, while war still waited in the background of their lives. And that is why people who watch the Strasbourg match closely still talk about it differently. Because the scoreboard only captured tennis. It did not capture the tensions sitting quietly underneath every point. It did not capture the emotional weight both women carried walking onto that court. And it certainly did not capture how a simple first-round match slowly turned into something that felt deeply human, emotional, and far bigger than sports alone. Knowing her father would finally be sitting in the stands again changed everything emotionally for Alexandra Olikova. After nearly 2 years without seeing him at one of her matches because of military service connected to the war in Ukraine, every point in Strasbourg suddenly carried more emotional weight than usual. She admitted afterward that the feeling stayed in her head constantly before the match. Part of her felt overwhelmed by the pressure and emotion surrounding the moment, but another part understood how rare and meaningful it was. More than anything, she wanted to keep winning long enough for him to stay and watch another match before returning to the front lines again. That detail alone completely changes how the atmosphere around the tournament felt. Because on the opposite side of the net stood a player carrying a very different kind of story and a very different kind of pressure. Ila arrived in Europe as one of the biggest breakout names in women's tennis during the 2026 season, but her rise did not happen overnight the way many casual fans suddenly assumed. Long before international headlines and packed crowds started following her matches, she had already spent years building quietly through the lower levels of professional tennis. The work started far away from the spotlight. As a young left-hander from the Philippines, Ila developed much of her game at the Rafa Nadal Academy, where discipline, patience, and relentless repetition shaped her style. While many rising prospects chase attention early, Ila's path looked slower and more methodical. She spent years grinding through ITF tournaments, smaller challenger events, and difficult qualifying draws where very few outside hardcore tennis fans were paying attention. But inside the sport, people were already noticing. Coaches talked about her composure. Players respected her movement and court awareness. Scouts recognized her competitiveness long before the rankings exploded. Before global attention arrived, she had already built a solid professional foundation with an ITF title, deep challenger runs, and growing respect throughout the tour as a player who kept improving every season. Then 2026 changed everything. The breakthrough started in Auckland, where Ila made a stunning run to the semifinals and suddenly forced the tennis world to pay attention. That tournament became historic because she became the first Filipino woman ever to break into the WTA Top 50. For many athletes, reaching that milestone alone would define an entire career. For Ila, it became the beginning. After Auckland, something shifted around her almost immediately. The crowds started growing larger. Fans began showing up carrying Philippine flags. Cities that previously treated her as another young player on tour suddenly reacted differently when she arrived. The atmosphere around her matches changed from curiosity into genuine excitement. And that transformation matters because it reveals how quickly sports can elevate someone from promising prospect into national symbol. One season earlier, Ila was still quietly climbing through the system. Now, she was becoming one of the faces of a new generation in women's tennis. That sudden visibility also brought pressure. Every tournament became bigger emotionally. Expectations increased. Analysts started discussing rankings, Grand Slam draws, and future championship potential. Every win created louder reactions. Every loss generated deeper conversations. So when Strasbourg arrived, both women stepped onto the same court carrying completely different emotional realities. Olikova carried family reunion, war, and the emotional significance of competing in front of her father again. Ila carried the pressure of a rapidly rising career, growing international attention, and the expectations surrounding one of the fastest improving young players on tour. That is why the match felt larger than a normal early round encounter. Because beneath the rankings and scorelines were two deeply human stories unfolding at the exact same time. One built around sacrifice, displacement, and emotional survival. The other built around breakthrough success, national pride, and the overwhelming speed of sudden global recognition. And somewhere in the middle of all that emotion, the tennis itself almost became secondary to the human weight both players carried onto the court. Coming into Strasbourg, everything seemed to favor Alex Ila. Earlier in the season, she had climbed to a career-high ranking of world number 29, a remarkable achievement for a 20-year-old still adjusting to the physical and mental demands of the professional tour. Even after a difficult stretch of results, she still entered Strasbourg ranked number 38 in the world, firmly established as one of the rising names in women's tennis. And the recent form was not bad at all when viewed in full context. At the Italian Open in Rome, she had produced one of the strongest performances of her clay season. She battled through a physically exhausting match against Magdalena Frech, showing resilience under pressure before eventually falling in the third round to world number 2 Elena Rybakina. Even in defeat, many analysts believed Ila looked more comfortable on clay than ever before. That matters because clay had once been considered one of the weaker surfaces in her development. Now she was competing against elite players and holding her ground. So when the Strasbourg draw came out, most observers viewed her as the clear favorite. She was younger, ranked significantly higher, arriving with more momentum, and carrying far more international attention than her first-round opponent. On paper, nearly every measurable category leaned heavily in her direction. But tennis has always been one of those sports where statistics only explain part of the story. The emotional side often matters just as much. And that is where the matchup became far more complicated than rankings suggested. Because across the net stood Alexandra Olikova, a player whose life story carried layers of pressure and emotional history invisible to most fans looking only at rankings and recent results. Born in Kiev, Olikova's childhood changed dramatically when her family fled Ukraine while she was still very young. Part of her upbringing later unfolded in Croatia after the family relocated, forcing her to adapt to a completely different environment during years that normally shape identity, stability, and belonging. She has spoken openly about how difficult those early years were, not only emotionally but professionally. Starting over in a new country did not suddenly open doors in tennis. In many ways, it made the path even harder. She had to rebuild from the ground up while trying to establish herself inside a system where opportunities, resources, and recognition did not come easily. Even basic ranking progression became difficult because she lacked the structure many top junior players rely on early in their careers. That is important context because it explains the mentality she developed. Her journey was never simply about winning tennis matches. It became about survival, adaptation, identity, and proving she belonged in spaces where she often felt like an outsider trying to build stability from uncertainty. Players shaped by experiences like that often compete differently emotionally. They become mentally stubborn. They learn how to stay calm inside uncomfortable